Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. One of the best books I read in 2023 was Rick Ridgway's Life Lived Wild. This is his autobiography and shows how he lived life on his own terms while also exploring the world. The book was inspiring and heartfelt, and I was beyond delighted when Rick agreed to come on our podcast. Hi, Rick. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, Richard, it's great to join you. Looking forward to it.
You've lived this incredible life, including these incredible expeditions, first descents, journeys to places that people didn't even know existed, and then a storied career at Patagonia. But I'm interested, how did your passion for the outdoors get ignited in the first place?
Well, it was actually a negative experience when I was in my early teens, and I grew up in part in rural parts of Orange County. And when I was only 12 and 13, 14 years old, the rural areas that I grew up in were paved over for housing tracts, and it just shocked me to see that happen. So I literally fled into the mountains surrounding Los Angeles, and my mother got increasingly worried as I was climbing the hills around the area by myself with a book that I bought on how to climb. So she sent me to what back then was only the first outward bound school ever in the west coast of the United States in Oregon. And that really cemented my passion for mountaineering. I was only 17 years old at the time, and here I am, almost 75 years old, and still loving the mountains, still loving hiking. Not any great mountaineering anymore, but my heart's still in it.
Your book has, so many great journeys, including the first descent of K2. But the one I found really interesting was this Seven Summits expedition. And I just found it was, this audacious goal, these interesting characters. Can you share a little bit more what that expedition was like?
Sure, but it was the first American ascent of K2. The mountain that was in 1978. And the mountain had actually been climbed twice before we made the third ascent. But on to the Seven Summits expeditions, which were about 5 years after the K2 trip, two businessmen, Frank Wells and Dick Bass, met each other by happenstance, and they learned that also by happenstance, they both shared this same sort of quixotic dream to be the first to climb the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents. And they were very successful in business. Dick had a oil and gas company in Dallas, and he owned the Snowbird ski resort, and Frank Wells was the president of Warner Brothers Studios. But neither of them knew very much about climbing or mountaineering, and they needed guides. So they'd heard about me, and they got a hold of me and invited me to come on their trips, and I was able to join them on 3 of those 7 climbs, and they pulled it off. It took Dick 3 tries at Everest, but finally he got to the top, and at age 55, he was at that time the oldest man to ever climb Everest and the first ever to climb the 7 summits. And back at base camp, in a wizened voice, he called me on the radio phone and he said, "Rick, it just goes to show you that the second half," and by that he meant life after 50, "the second half can be and should be the best half." And Richard, that is something that I've always remembered, and I actually try to live by it. I abide by it too. I agree with Dick. The second half is really the best half.
That's great. That's great. One thing I found really interesting was you had a group of friends called the Do Boys. And can you maybe tell me a little bit more about this? It seems like such a great idea that, I know it's myself aging, you end up losing all these friends to do fun stuff with because people have jobs and families, but you guys managed to make it work.
Well, that little clique of friends started in the early 70s when I met Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. And he and I hit it off, and we started surfing together and climbing together. And several years later, he introduced me to one of his oldest friends and climbing partners, Doug Tompkins. And Doug had founded the North Face, and he sold that to go on and found the Esprit women's wear company. And the three of us started going on adventures together around the world, and we would bring in other friends for other adventures. And one time, Doug said he had been in Tokyo on business, and he ran into a Japanese comic book about a band of buddies that went around just doing stuff, having adventures together. And the group was called themselves the Do Boys. And Doug suggested that would be a moniker for our little posse, and it stuck. So that was it. We became the Do Boys, and we liked to do stuff. So again, we had adventures in Patagonia and all up and down North America and in Asia and Africa, all over the place.
And what I found really interesting is there was really kind of like not a relaxed attitude, but things just kind of happened. These were not meticulously planned expeditions. Part of it seemed just this, desire just to go and experience life and do these incredible trips and just deal with, sometimes you had bad weather or, you had to turn back, but it just seemed like a different ethos from the way a lot of people look at doing trips like this that are really, really regimented.
Yeah, it was interesting because Doug and Yvonne were both such successful businessmen. They built two of the most iconic brands in outdoor sports, the North Face and Patagonia. And of course, in business, you have to be goal-oriented and you have to be pretty organized. You have to have a plan how you're going to get from, one season to the next to succeed. But when it came time to climbing and to our expeditions, they cherished spontaneity. And indeed, some of the trips themselves were even spontaneous. One time, Yvonne got a copy of a magazine called Earthwatch from a nonprofit by the same name, and it had a photograph of these rock spires on the cover, and the caption said, "Taken from a remote place in the Magellanic fjords of southern Chile." And that's all it said. So we found out where the mountains were, and we decided to go climb them. Doug and Yvonne and another climbing friend, Jim Danini, we had to take a fishing boat up a really remote fjord with collapsible sea kayaks where the boat let us off on this toehold of land, and we climbed this really steep rock spire and then had to paddle for 10 days to get back to the nearest civilization. And it was a terrific adventure done with hardly any planning, that happened with just a spontaneous encounter from the cover of a magazine sitting in Yvonne's living room. So a lot of the trips started that way. And even during the trips, we would often change course or change direction or even change objective. There's one story in my book, Life Lived Wild, about an invitation to go to Bhutan as the first American mountaineering expedition ever allowed into that country to attempt to climb what back then was the highest unclimbed mountain in the world. And as a little teaser, it still is the highest unclimbed mountain in the world, because on that trip we failed to even find the mountain. It was in such a remote area that there were no maps, and we ended up going up the wrong valley. Once we discovered our mistake, we realized there was not enough time in the climbing season to go down and around and find the proper approach to the mountain that we were supposed to climb. So we just pivoted. And Doug said, well, it's like that old rock and roll song, if you just gotta love the one you're with. So we climbed the mountains that were in this little valley that was, realistically off the map. There were no maps. And it turned out to be a terrific expedition that ended in a way none of us ever would have imagined. And in fact, I tell the story of how on that trip, we were careful to make maps. We made these carefully drawn ridgeline maps with our compass and altimeter, again, because there were no maps and we wanted to document this valley that was unexplored. And at the end of that trip, Yvonne, we were around the campfire on our last night at base camp, and he said, this trip turned out so great because it was so different than what we had expected. And And I love that. I love the way it turned out, except for one thing. And we said, what's that, Yvonne? He said, well, it's those maps we made. And we said, what's wrong with the maps? He said, well, I think we should leave this place just like we found it. That we had to discover what was here. We didn't even know where we were going, and whoever follows us ought to have the same experience. And we said, what do you want to do with the maps? And he said, let's burn them. So, iconoclastic Yvonne Chouinard, we took these maps we had so carefully drawn, and as the last gesture at base camp before we turned and left, we threw the maps on our campfire and burned them.
I'm so glad you shared that, because that's something that I feel is really lost. And I love reading, exploration books or travel books from the 1800s and up until about 1955 or 1960, because people didn't know where they were going. There was no maps and this sense of discovery. It's so hard now where there's 100 YouTube videos on almost any place you want to go now, that this idea of just seeing something you didn't even know existed is gone. One of my favorite stories in the book is your expedition for tracking the Chiru in Tibet. And I found it beautiful, but also heartbreaking. And I was wondering if you can share a bit more about that trip.
In 2002, I had an opportunity to go on an expedition that was much different than anything I had been on previously. Before, it had always been about climbing a mountain and reaching the summit. It was about what as a mountaineer, and my friends and I could do as achievements. This trip was to try to use our mountaineering skills to save an endangered goat antelope called the Chiru that lives in the most remote parts of the northwestern Tibetan plateau. And a friend of mine, George Schaller, arguably the most eminent conservation biologist in the world, had been doing a long-term study on the Chiru, and through him, I had learned that the animals migrated, the females migrated every year in the early summer up on the northern margin of the Tibetan plateau, and that somewhere up there they had their calves, and then towards the end of the summer they would come back down into the area where George was studying them. Now that area itself was nearly off the map. It was very remote. But where these animals were going to have their babies was even more remote. It was literally unknown. There had been no outside explorers that had ever been into this region. The reason George needed to know where these calving grounds were was because across the southern part of the range where he was studying them, they were being poached. They were being killed for their wool, which turned out to be the finest wool of any animal in the world. And it was being illegally smuggled out of Tibet and into Kashmir, where it was woven into women's shawls that had become fashion hits. And women were paying so much money for these shawls, sometimes $5,000 and $10,000 for one shawl, that enough of that money was getting back to the poachers that they were decimating the herds. And George was afraid that if the poachers discovered the calving grounds before they could be protected, it might be extinction for the animal. But he could never figure out where the calving grounds were because the area was just too remote. There were no human beings that lived in that region. No outsiders had ever been in there. And I went to him and said, what if some of my mountaineering buddies and I followed these animals on foot with our climbing skills? And he said, you can't do it. It's too far. It's 300 miles. It's uninhabited. You can't carry that much food and supplies. And I'd kind of left it at that when I was in the lobby of a hotel in Salt Lake City at an outdoor industry conference, and I saw this statue of a Mormon family pulling a handcart across the Great Plains on their way to Utah. And I had this light bulb come on. That was it, handcarts. So I went to National Geographic. I got a grant from them to organize 3 of my climbing buddies, Conrad Angner, Galen Rowell, and Jimmy Chin, to build handcarts, load them up with our supplies, and migrate with the animals across the Tibetan plateau to discover where they were having their babies. And we ended up doing it. We had to walk almost 300 miles at an average elevation of 16,000 feet across an area not only uninhabited, but completely in its heart unexplored. There were no people from the West that had ever been there. And we were able to follow the animals to their calving grounds. We documented them with video and still cameras. We published a book. We made a movie. We wrote an article for National Geographic. And Dr. Schaller sent all this media back to China. And with it, he convinced them to create a protected area around the calving grounds. And then we raised money to help the Chinese pay for guards to protect the new area. And they were able to turn back poachers a couple years later. And since then, every year, as George Schaller has continued his studies, he's confirmed that the animals are actually bouncing back. They're increasing. And for me and my colleagues, it was one of the most fulfilling expeditions of our career. For Galen Rao, who was the oldest of our team back then, he said of his storied career, this one was absolutely the most fulfilling because it wasn't about us, but it was about how we could use our skills to save an endangered species. And it just felt good that instead of just putting all our energy into getting to some summit and beating on our chests, we were able to use those skills to make a difference. We were able to use our skills to be more than just who we were as mountaineers. And I love that. It's still my favorite trip. But then it's poignant because even though the animals are increasing, the edges of the Tibetan plateau of that remote Changtang region, they're being chipped away. The gold miners are still moving in on the edges. Even though it's a protected area, in many places it's a paper park, as they call them, where the protection is more on paper than it is on the ground. There's always so much work to be done, but again, at least for now, those Shiru are heading in the right direction instead of the wrong one.
That's a great story, and I wonder, having spent all this time in remote and wild places, how has that influenced how you see the world?
I like to be observant of what I call baselines. And what I mean by that is an effort to try to understand what the wild world was really like before we human beings started to change it. And I've been fortunate enough in my career as an explorer and adventurer to have been to a few places on our planet that had very little, if any, imprint of our species on the landscape. One time in the upper Amazon, where the Orinoco and the Amazon rivers nearly touch, I got a chance to go into a section of jungle that was completely uninhabited, where the nearest villagers were Yanomami people that had just been visited a few years before by anthropologists, into an area that to these wild Yanomami was even wilder yet. And in that jungle, where there were no human beings at all, that you could just feel the animals' curiosity coming up close to you. I remember one day sitting down by myself on a dead fallen log to rest, and through the understory of the jungle, I saw this fireball coming right at me, and it looked like an apparition, and I was stunned. I was shocked. It was as though there was some alien object coming straight at me, this giant fireball, and it was turning right and going left and then zigzagging right towards me. And all of a sudden, this enormous orange bird called the cock of the rock landed right in front of me, 5 feet away. And it was the size of a chicken, and it just turned its head, this strange-looking head, and it eyed me, and I knew that it had never seen a human being before. So I've got baselines. And even here where I live in Southern California, I love to go to the La Brea tar pits and look at those fossils of the animals that used to be here in the Los Angeles and Southern California area before we human beings showed up. I love to imagine the assemblage of the megafauna, the short-faced bears that were 30% bigger than grizzly bears, the giant tree sloths that could stand on their hind legs and reach into the canopies of the trees like giraffes, the herds of wild horses that were striped just like zebras, and the camels and the elephants, 3 species. It was the Serengeti of North America, right here in California, until we human beings showed up. And within 400 years of our arrival, most of those animals were headed to extinction, and within a few hundred more years, they were gone. And while it's controversial exactly why they went extinct, the coincidence of their extinction so close to we humans' arrival is so exact that almost without doubt, it was our agency that led to their extinction. So when I look at wilderness in Southern California, I see it through my mind's eye of what it was like before we human beings got here and changed the landscape so incredibly. So those are the baselines that I have, and those are the baselines against which I measure what real wildness and wilderness is like. And again, I've been fortunate to be in a few places on this planet where there have hardly been any human beings at all, and I know what that feels like, and I know what it looks like, and it's magical.
That leads into your role at Patagonia, and a lot of people know you for your work there, where you oversaw environmental affairs, as Patagonia became a leading voice around the threat to our planet. What was it like being there as Patagonia took this, really strong message to the world?
I joined Patagonia in 2004 as a VP of Environmental Initiatives. So I oversaw their commitment to saving the environment. That was the reason they were in business. That's what Yvonne wanted to use Patagonia to do, to save what was left of the wild part of the world. But it was a complex job because that also included the footprint of the company itself and the responsibility to reduce that footprint as much as we could in every corner of the company's business. And that part of the job was called sustainability. And I didn't know anything about that when I started, so I had to do a quick study on it. But we managed to really lead the whole industry, not only in sustainability, but in showing not just the industry, the world, what a company could do when it's set its mind to using its wealth to protect the planet. And of course, you might ask, why should a company do that? And the answer goes back to all of our time in the mountains, in wilderness, in nature, with Yvonne and Doug Tompkins, and as you said earlier, our posse that we called ourselves the Do Boys. We were also pretty successful business people. And with all that time in wilderness, we fell in love with wilderness. We fell in love with nature. So that's where our commitment to protect nature came from. And then we also, over time, realized, and Doug and Yvonne taught me this, that all businesses rely on a healthy planet to be successful. That all businesses, whether goods or services, to one degree or more, need natural resources to sustain their businesses. And you need a healthy planet to have a healthy stream of resources. And you need a healthy planet in order to have healthy societies. Because without healthy societies, there's no such thing as healthy markets. So you see there's this direct connection between a healthy planet and a healthy business that so few business people seem to understand. But Yvonne's own environmental mentor, David Brower, famously said, "It's because there is no business on a dead planet." So Patagonia really understood these connections. And that understanding was the foundational reason why Yvonne and his family decided to use the business to protect what's left of the wild part of the world. And I couldn't have been more proud of the company and more proud of the Chenard family when, a year and a half ago now, they transferred 100% of the company's shares into a foundation and to a not-for-profit that is now forevermore obligated to take 100% of the company's profits and give them back to the groups that are fighting to save what's left of the wild parts of our planet Earth. And that means that Patagonia now is essentially owned by the Earth, that the company is in business to save the planet. And I hope it's a model that other companies can look at and replicate.
You know, Rick, while you were talking there, I got chills. It's just such an incredible way to live authentically and to put your beliefs into action, which I think is really inspiring. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about mortality, because in your book, as you make clear, you've had to deal with issues of mortality. And most people don't have to do this in kind of the way you have to do as a mountaineer. And I'm wondering, how does seeing mortality firsthand impact the way you approach life or live your life?
As an adventurer, I've had a few close encounters. When I was in China in 1980 on the first American expedition ever allowed into the People's Republic, we were attempting a remote mountain called Minyakonka. And partway up, with 3 companions, including Yvonne, we triggered an avalanche and we were swept 1,500 vertical feet down the side of the mountain. And it probably took a full minute to go that far. And that's a long, long minute when you think that you're dead. And in fact, when you can't even imagine there's a way to get out alive. But I survived. We were all injured. My close friend, Jonathan, roped next to me, was so grievously injured that he died in my arms, and I had to bury him on the side of the mountain. And for the next 3 years, I wasn't sure I wanted to continue to climb. I wasn't sure I could continue to take the risks. But then eventually I realized that I had so much of who I was and so much of who I still could be was from my time in wildness, my time in nature, that I would go back and I would really, really pay attention to managing risks instead of just taking risks. And I knew that was the secret to move forward, but I also knew the secret to the vitality with which I wanted to live my life was to continue to be in those risky positions. So I had a few other close encounters. In Borneo, I got typhoid fever, and we were in the middle of the island in a very remote place, and that nearly killed me. And then even just a few years ago, I was kayaking in Patagonia on a remote lake, very cold water, when a windstorm came up and flipped the boat I was in with Doug Tompkins, and we both had to swim for our lives. And by the time I made it out, I was unconscious, and by the time Doug got out, he was dead. So those experiences, Richard, have taught me how profoundly important it is to live each day as fully as you can. I remember one time being in the office of another climbing friend and seeing a little card above his desk that said, "You need to learn as though you're going to live forever, but you need to live as though you're going to die tomorrow. And I've tried to take that to heart. I try to live each day with the knowledge that, like all of us, that could be our last day. And it's banal to always, and perhaps sound trite sounding, to say that all of us are wise to know how to live in the moment. But when you have come close to death, and in fact, when you've stood on the edge and looked into the abyss, then it does facilitate that commitment to live each day as fully as you can. And even all of you listening to this who perhaps haven't had that experience of walking up to the edge and looking into the darkness, that nevertheless, all of you can do better reminding yourself of the importance of wringing out of each day all the joy and all the fulfilling things you can do with your life, and just celebrating the moments where you walk outside of the office and look up into the sky and take a deep breath and feel yourself alive. It is so important for all of us to live just as fully as we can each day of our lives. And I've learned too, coming close to death several times, to not turn my back on death when it comes to those that I love. And I talk about that in my book, Life Lived Wild, especially how, as I was finishing the book, I lost my wife to cancer. And I write about that too. She was a companion with me on some of my trips. She and one of my closest friends, Chris Tompkins, Doug's wife and widow, were best friends, and they're all characters in my story. But I also tell the reader how, when I did lose my wife, I consciously chose not to turn my back on her because of the pain of her death. I tell the reader that I don't believe in this American idea of closure. That, in fact, I think we all would be wise to do the opposite when we lose those who we love and those who mean the most to us in our lives. That instead of trying to close them out and to close their memories because we don't want to face the pain, that we should open our arms and embrace the pain. And that is the best way of keeping them alive inside of us. And that may be the most important legacy that any of us can hope to have, to live on inside and to inspire those who we leave behind.
Wow, Rick, there's so much wisdom there. And, when you wrote it in the book, it's such a powerful writing. And I think I said in my first email to you, I was sitting in a hotel in Japan reading your book, and I had tears streaming down my face. And I looked around the other Japanese people beside me. You don't show emotion. Here I am reading my Kindle. It's beautifully written. It's powerfully written. And it's, the way you've described it here and given more. I thank you for sharing that. It's so powerful and so much wisdom. And maybe that leads on to the next question, which is, you've kind of lived a life by going against conventional wisdom. Now there's more people pursuing these lives where they do things that are audacious and different. But when you started doing this 40 years ago, your life, your choices in life were not, the regular American way forward. Why do you think you were so confident pursuing this lifestyle that is, not normal, and definitely wasn't normal 40 years ago?
Back when I really embraced climbing and adventuring in the 1960s, mountaineering and climbing was a marginal sport at best. I remember one of my climbing partners said famously that at both ends of the social spectrum there lies a leisure class. And it wasn't as though we were sitting around on our butts not doing anything, but the connection was that we weren't working to earn money to have a career. We were doing odd jobs. In my case, painting houses, getting oddball carpentry jobs, anything I could do to earn a nickel to fund my next adventure. And that's what we were living for. It was to go out into the wildest parts of the world and live our lives there, even though we were turning our backs on, what the usual path was for most people in their lives, to find something you're good at, to build it into a career, to, have a family. We just turned our backs on that whole idea. And we went off, on our own, in our own form of poverty that wasn't poverty at all, but it was just seemed so enriched because we were enriched by our adventures, by being out in these wild places in the world. And there was definitely an insecurity to it because there was no understanding, in my part anyway, about what I was going to do when I had to figure out how to earn a living. But I remember so consciously deciding that I was still going to turn my back on that. I remember reading a Zen book one time called The Wisdom of Insecurity, and even the title stuck with me, that I had to discipline myself to know that I could figure out the part about how to live successfully in the society I was in, but I didn't need to dedicate my life to trying to figure that out in the beginning. It was almost like I would retire in reverse. And it worked out. I was able to figure out how, through photography and film and storytelling, to make a living, making movies and writing books and publishing magazine stories. And then I became a consultant in the outdoor business so that I was able to turn avocation into vocation, and it worked. But that wasn't the goal in the beginning. And if there's anything I have to offer to your listeners who are like I was in their late teens and early 20s now, looking forward into their lives, it's to follow the passions of your heart and convince yourself that you can figure it out later on. You can figure out how you're going to fit into society in a way that you can create value so that it will reward you with what you need to make your way through. But then by living to your passions foremost, that other part is much more likely to fall into place.
That's beautifully said, Rick. I have one last question, and I mentioned to you, I discovered your book from a recommendation from a journalist, and one of my favorite things is when people who are readers share their favorite books with me. And I wonder, do you have some favorite books that you want to recommend to listeners?
Well, I do. In fact, I'm going to. I know we're video conferencing in here a little bit. I'm in my little house where I live in Ojai, California, near Santa Barbara, and I'm walking through my living room, and you might see that my room here is I am surrounded with books. Here we are on all sides. And on my fireplace mantle right here, I have the shelves of books that have meant the most to me in my life. Peter Matheson's The Snow Leopard, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cormac McCarthy, and Sir Ernest Shackleton, Maurice Herzog, and Jack London, and some less known books, Dersu the Trapper, and The Uttermost Part of the Earth, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and then probably my favorite of all, Wind, Sand, and Stars by Saint-Exupéry. I don't know if you can see that right on the end there. And that last one is my most treasured one because it's autographed by the author.
It's beautiful in there, and I am so jealous of your little ladder. I've always wanted to have a library where I needed a little ladder to get up because it's like a old library you see in movies or you read about in books. Rick, this has been incredible. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, sharing more about the stories in your book. If people want to find out more, how can they find out more about you, or where can they find the book?
My latest book, Life Lived Wild, was published by Patagonia, and you can get it on their website, or of course in a bookstore or Amazon. And then I also have a website, rickridgeway.com, and there's more information about the things that I'm doing around my books and other things that I've done. And the listeners are welcome to check that out as well.
Excellent. I'll put links to both of those into the show notes. And once again, I can't recommend Rick's book enough. It's just such a engaging read, but with so much wisdom, and a great gift for birthdays, anniversaries. I think Father's Day is coming up soon. So just a really, really wonderful book. And with that, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.